Hi everyone, this is chapter 22 of Pride and Prejudice. Exciting thing. If you look at my book, I have all these post-its on the side, and this little post-it right here is volume the second, which means that we're only this many pages, which is just 10, away from finishing the first volume of Pride and Prejudice. Woohoo! Chapter 22. The Bennets were engaged to dine with the Lucases, and again, during the chief of the day, was Miss Lucas so kind as to listen to Mr. Collins. Elizabeth took an opportunity of thanking her. "It keeps him in good humor," said she, "and I am more obliged to you than I can express." Charlotte assured her friend of her satisfaction in being useful, and that it amply repaid her for the little sacrifice of her time. This was very amiable, but Charlotte's kindness extended farther than Elizabeth had any conception of. Its object was nothing less than to secure her from any return of Mr. Collins' addresses, by engaging them towards herself. What does that mean? That means that Charlotte Lucas has a secret motive, an ulterior objective behind talking to Mr. Collins. Her plan is that by talking to him, she's going to divert his attention away from Elizabeth and change his addresses by engaging them towards herself. Mr. Collins's address to Elizabeth was asking her to marry him, so Charlotte wants him to propose to her. Such was Miss Lucas's scheme, and appearances were so favorable that when they parted at night she would have felt almost sure of success if he had not been to leave Hertfordshire very soon. But here she did injustice to the fire and independence of his character, for it led him to escape out of Longbourn House the next morning with admirable slyness, and hasten to Lucas Lodge to throw himself at her feet. He was anxious to avoid the notice of his cousins, from a conviction that, if they saw him depart, they could not fail to conjecture his design, and he was not willing to have the attempt known till its success could be known likewise. For, though feeling almost secure, and with reason, for Charlotte had been tolerably encouraging, he was comparatively diffident since the adventure of Wednesday. His reception, however, was of the most flattering kind. Miss Lucas perceived him from an upper window as he walked towards the house, and instantly set out to meet him accidentally in the lane. We know that that is a highly sarcastic use of the word accidentally. You don't see someone and then accidentally go outside to meet them. But little had she dared to hope that so much love and eloquence awaited her there. So Mr. Collins leaves early from Longbourn to go over to Lucas Lodge and propose to Charlotte. Keep in mind, he is not too confident, so he doesn't let anyone know that he's going to propose. His recent proposal adventure, as we know, did not go well for him. He was not accepted, so this time he's not telling anyone that he is going to propose until he has successfully secured a yes. In as short a time as Mr. Collins' long speeches would allow, everything was settled between them to the satisfaction of both, and as they entered the house he earnestly entreated her to name the day that was to make him the happiest of men, and though such a solicitation must be waived for the present, the lady felt no inclination to trifle with his happiness. The stupidity with which he was favored by nature must guard his courtship from any charm that could make a woman wish for its continuance, and Miss Lucas, who accepted him solely from the pure and disinterested desire of an establishment, cared not how soon that establishment were gained. Oh my God, what a burn. Jane Austen is telling us that Mr. Collins is so stupid that he's not very charming in flirting or dating, and Charlotte Lucas sees no reason to prolong the courtship. She thinks of this as a business arrangement, so she just wants to get down to getting married and moving in with him. Sir William and Lady Lucas were speedily applied to for their consent, and it was bestowed with a most joyful alacrity. Mr. Collins' present circumstances made it a most eligible match for their daughter, to whom they could give little fortune, and his prospects of future wealth were exceedingly fair. Lady Lucas began directly to calculate, with more interest than the matter had ever excited before, how many years longer Mr. Bennet was likely to live, and Sir William gave it as his decided opinion that whenever Mr. Collins should be in possession of the Longbourn estate, it would be highly expedient that both he and his wife should make their appearance at St. James. The whole family, in short, were properly overjoyed on the occasion. Just notice that the Lucases are now counting down to when Mr. Bennet is going to die and their daughter will inherit Longbourn. The younger girls formed hopes of coming out a year or two sooner than they might otherwise have done, and the boys were relieved from their apprehension of Charlotte's dying an old maid. Poor Charlotte. Coming out is when you come out into society as a young woman and you're considered eligible to be dated and courted by men. So you're kind of like on the marriage playing field of Regency England. Charlotte herself was tolerably composed. She had gained her point and had time to consider of it. Her reflections were in general satisfactory. Mr. Collins, to be sure, was neither sensible nor agreeable. His society was irksome, and his attachment to her must be imaginary, but still he would be her husband. Without thinking highly either of men or of matrimony, marriage had always been her object. It was the only honorable provision for well-educated young women of small fortune, and however uncertain of giving happiness, must be their pleasantest preservative from want. This preservative she had now obtained, and at the age of 27, without having ever been handsome, she felt all the good luck of it. 27 in Jane Austen's time, Regency England, was considered older to get married. Charlotte, very much as we've known from earlier conversations, thinks of this as a business arrangement. She's never been boy crazy, never been really that interested in matrimony as a sign of love, but really just as a way of ensuring her place in the world. And I think Jane Austen's a little bit critical of this condition of society. It was the only honorable provision for well-educated young women of small fortune. Must be their pleasantest preservative from want. So Charlotte is really marrying Mr. Collins because she does not want to go hungry. And, you know, he's not really that much of a catch, at least personality-wise, but this is something that will ensure her survival and her thriving. So we are forced to think about, or led to think about, what this sort of society expects of women and where women's place is in this society, and by extension, if that is something that is ethical and moral. The least agreeable circumstance in the business, the marriage, was the surprise it must occasion to Elizabeth Bennet, whose friendship she valued beyond that of any other person. Elizabeth would wonder, and probably would blame her, and though her resolution was not to be shaken, her feelings must be hurt by such a disapprobation. She resolved to give her the information herself, and therefore charged Mr. Collins, when he returned to Longbourn to dinner, to drop no hint of what had passed before any of the family. A promise of secrecy was of course very dutifully given, but it could not be kept without difficulty, for the curiosity excited by his long absence burst forth in such very direct questions on his return as required some ingenuity to evade, and he was at the same time exercising great self-denial, for he was longing to publish his prosperous love. So Charlotte's a little bit concerned that Elizabeth is going to be upset with her. She tells Mr. Collins not to share that they are engaged just yet. Mr. Collins is having a hard time doing that because he wants to publish his prosperous love. So he wants to say, yes, someone accepted me. As he was to begin his journey too early on the morrow to see any of the family, the ceremony of leave-taking was performed when the ladies moved for the night, and Mrs. Bennet, with great politeness and cordiality, said how happy they should be to see him at Longbourn again, whenever his other engagements might allow him to visit them. My dear madam, he replied, this invitation is particularly gratifying because it is what I have been hoping to receive, and you may be very certain that I shall avail myself of it as soon as possible. They were all astonished, and Mr. Bennet, who could by no means wish for so speedy a return, immediately said, but is there not danger of Lady Catherine's disapprobation here, my good sir? You had better neglect your relations than run the risk of offending your patroness. My dear sir, replied Mr. Collins, I am particularly obliged to you for this friendly caution, and you may depend upon my not taking so material a step without her ladyship's concurrence. You cannot be too much on your guard, risk anything rather than her displeasure, and if you find it likely to be raised by your coming to us again, which I should think exceedingly probable, stay quietly at home and be satisfied that we shall take no offense. Believe me, my dear sir, my gratitude is warmly excited by such affectionate attention, and depend upon it, you will speedily receive from me a letter of thanks for this as well as for every other mark of your regard during my stay in Hertfordshire. As for my fair cousins, though my absence may not be long enough to render it necessary, I shall now take the liberty of wishing them health and happiness, not excepting my cousin Elizabeth. So there's this weird sort of back and forth now that goes on between Mr. Bennet and Mr. Collins, where Mrs. Bennet says, "Oh, come back anytime," just out of politeness. And then Mr. Collins says, "Yeah, great, I was waiting for that invitation." No one knows that it's because he wants to see Charlotte Lucas, and Mr. Bennet doesn't really want him there again because Mr. Bennet is incredibly annoyed by Mr. Collins. So Mr. Bennet goes, "Oh, don't offend Lady Catherine, rather offend us by not coming back for a while." Like trying to shove him out. And then Mr. Collins goes, "Oh no, don't worry, I'm sure she would approve." And there's this weird sort of moment of dramatic irony where we know what all the characters are thinking, but Mr. Collins doesn't know that. Mr. Bennet wants him out, and Mr. Bennet and the rest of the Bennets don't know that Mr. Collins is engaged. With proper civilities, the ladies then withdrew, all of them equally surprised to find that he meditated a quick return. Mrs. Bennet wished to understand by it that he thought of paying his addresses to one of her younger girls, and Mary might have been prevailed on to accept him. She rated his abilities much higher than any of the others. There was a solidity in his reflections that often struck her, and though by no means so clever as herself, she thought that, if encouraged to read and improve himself by such an example as hers, he might become a very agreeable companion. But on the following morning every hope of this kind was done away. Miss Lucas called soon after breakfast, and in a private conference with Elizabeth, related the event of the day before. So Mrs. Bennet is thinking maybe he wants to marry the next daughter in line. Maybe he's going down and thinking about Mary. And Mary doesn't mind him so much. They share that intellectual sort of bent, although Mary doesn't think that he's as smart as she is, and she's probably right. So that's a possibility floating around in the air, but then Charlotte Lucas comes to tell Elizabeth the news. The possibility of Mr. Collins fancying himself in love with her friend had once occurred to Elizabeth within the last day or two, but that Charlotte could encourage him seemed almost as far from possibility as that she could encourage him herself, and her astonishment was consequently so great as to overcome at first the bounds of decorum, and she could not help crying out, "Engaged to Mr. Collins? My dear Charlotte, impossible!" The steady countenance which Miss Lucas had commanded in telling her story gave way to a momentary confusion here on receiving so direct a reproach, though, as it was no more than she expected, she soon regained her composure and calmly replied, "Why should you be surprised, my dear Eliza? Do you think it incredible that Mr. Collins should be able to procure any woman's good opinion because he was not so happy as to succeed with you?" So Elizabeth is completely shocked that Charlotte has accepted Mr. Collins. She saw that maybe Mr. Collins may be interested in Charlotte, but she never thought that Charlotte would like him back. So she kind of exclaims. Charlotte's a little taken aback by Elizabeth exclaiming about this, and she has kind of a defensive, maybe even a little bit of a mean reply, depending on how you read this. So she says to her, "Why are you so surprised? Do you think just because you turned him down that no one else would ever be interested in him?" But Elizabeth had now recollected herself, and making a strong effort for it, was able to reassure her, with tolerable firmness, that the prospect of their relationship was highly grateful to her, and that she wished her all imaginable happiness. "I see what you are feeling," replied Charlotte. "You must be surprised, very much surprised, so lately as Mr. Collins was wishing to marry you. But when you have had time to think it all over, I hope you will be satisfied with what I have done. I am not romantic, I never was. I ask only a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins' character, connections, and situation in life, I am convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state." So again, we see that Charlotte has a very practical view of this. She says, "I'm not a romantic person. I'm not interested in romance or love. I just want a comfortable home. Mr. Collins is someone who'd be able to provide for me, who has a good position in life, has a good place to live. This seems to work for me." And in an odd way, they are strangely suited to each other, that they both think of marriage very much as a business contract rather than something that is done out of love. Elizabeth quietly answered, "Undoubtedly," and after an awkward pause, they returned to the rest of the family. Charlotte did not stay much longer, and Elizabeth was then left to reflect on what she had heard. It was a long time before she became at all reconciled to the idea of so unsuitable a match. The strangeness of Mr. Collins making 2 offers of marriage within 3 days was nothing in comparison of his being now accepted. In other words, it's really weird that Mr. Collins proposed twice in 3 days, but it's even weirder that Charlotte accepted him knowing that. She had always felt that Charlotte's opinion of matrimony was not exactly like her own, but she could not have supposed it possible that, when called into action, she would have sacrificed every better feeling to worldly advantage. Charlotte, the wife of Mr. Collins, was a most humiliating picture, and to the pang of a friend disgracing herself and sunk in her esteem was added the distressing conviction that it was impossible for a friend to be tolerably happy in the lot she had chosen. So we end this chapter with Elizabeth's reflections that her view of marriage and Charlotte's view of marriage were always different. She's surprised that Charlotte would be so worldly and so focused on that business survival aspect of marriage. And she's upset because she feels like Charlotte is marrying beneath her in the sense that Mr. Collins is not good enough for her. Not as far as social class or position or where he lives or anything like that, but Elizabeth just doesn't think that he is a worthy friend and lifetime companion for Charlotte. So she's upset about that. And she's also really upset that she can't see Charlotte ever being truly happy in this marriage. So in addition to all that shock and surprise, there's concern too about Charlotte's happiness. By having Charlotte marry Mr. Collins, Jane Austen is also making us think about what marriage means, and I think reflect on what marriage means to us. So are we more on Elizabeth's side, where it is something that's very much tied to love, or is there an aspect of convenience and comfort in it? I think that many people, especially nowadays, would side more with Elizabeth, but you do have to keep in mind the context and the time period, and consider that Charlotte's choice here is very much influenced by the knowledge that she will most likely not be able to support herself on her own. So perhaps it's less of a negative decision than we may nowadays reflect. But at the same time, you still have Elizabeth, who is very firm in her belief that marriage should be between people who are good friends and who like each other, and that there definitely should be some sort of a romantic component to a marriage, and that there should be love in a marriage. So something to think about as we end chapter 22.